This hearing will come to order. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Joint Economic Committee's hearing, Building on a Strong Foundation, Investments Today for a More Competitive Tomorrow. I'd like to thank all of our distinguished witnesses. We have an exceptional panel. Looking forward to hearing from each. Just 2 years ago, the United States confirmed its first case of COVID. Since then, hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost. Our nation has experienced the worst recession since the Great Depression. And virtually overnight, more than 22 million jobs disappeared and GDP cratered. This loss of life is a national tragedy, and we mourn the lives that were taken too soon. Today's hearing will focus on how our country is overcoming the economic effects of the pandemic, and what steps we can take now to ensure our economic health for the long term. As we convene this discussion, our nation's economic rebound has exceeded all expectations. The American Rescue Plan and other pandemic relief, including the successful dissemination of vaccines, have created a remarkably different economic reality than the one we were facing at the start of 2021. To date, nearly 93% of the jobs lost during the pandemic have been regained. The unemployment rate has fallen to just 1/10 of 1 percentage point above its pre-pandemic rate. And GDP has reached the fastest pace of job growth in nearly 40 years. President Biden has overseen the creation of 7.9 million jobs. In 2021, set a record for the most new businesses ever started. Far from guaranteed, the speed and strength of our economic recovery is a direct result of increased public investment. Thanks to the effort of this Congress and the Biden administration, the United States has experienced the fastest recovery among G7 nations. In fact, it remains the only major economy that has recovered to its pre-pandemic trend of economic growth, or what it would have been absent the coronavirus recession. But the United States has not escaped the global spike in inflation. Let me emphasize the global spike in inflation that is denying workers and families the full benefits of the recovery. Global supply chain disruptions have pushed up prices worldwide, and Putin's invasion of Ukraine is exacerbating the effects on energy and food prices. We in Congress have an opportunity to lower costs for workers and families, spur job creation, and promote U.S. competitiveness now and for generations to come. Evidence shows that public investment in research and technology drive innovation and boost productivity, which is the bedrock of long-term economic growth. Historically, U.S. economic booms have been fueled by investments in science and technology that were initiated and sustained by public funding. For example, we all know about the public investment in the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, that helps support the development of the personal computer and the internet. Together, these drove a technological revolution that turbocharged U.S. productivity and radically changed the way people conduct their lives, not to mention the creation of hundreds of thousands of new jobs. If a goal of our government is to drive broadly shared economic growth and ensure that the United States remains internationally competitive, public investment is essential to success. The recently passed Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is a down payment. It will address years of inadequate federal investment in critical infrastructure, roads, bridges, broadband, to create jobs, enhance productivity, and improve supply chain resilience. The economy-wide benefits will reduce long-term inflationary pressures. Congress should build on this foundation and pass the bipartisan competition bills to drive economic growth and shared prosperity. The investments in innovation, research, and manufacturing will boost our economic capacity, create high-quality jobs in communities across the country, and raise worker wages. And by promoting increased efficiency among workers and businesses, the investments will also lower costs. And this is the long-term strategic, structural way to address inflation. And the bill's focus on racial, gender, and geographic diversity in training and in education will help ensure that communities who have been historically excluded are able to share in the benefits. We've all experienced in many ways disinvestment in American-made products has contributed to recent supply chain disruptions. And the investments in this legislation will help shore up American supply chains and domestic manufacturing. The pandemic shined a new light on inequality in this country and exposed underlying vulnerabilities in our economy that are constricting our collective potential. We have an opportunity now to lower out-of-pocket costs for families on the biggest household expenses, while also paving the way for economic growth in the longer term that is stronger, stabler, and much more broadly shared. As we dive into these issues, I look forward to the testimonies of our expert witnesses. I'd now like to turn it over to Senator Lee for his opening statement. Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, pro-growth policies brought the American economy roaring to life in a way that bigger government and more central control never could. But while the strong economy lifted up all Americans, historically disadvantaged groups benefited the most. Unemployment for Hispanic Americans, Black Americans, and Asian Americans fell to the lowest rates on record. The unemployment rate for women dropped to its lowest level in almost 70 years, and low-income workers saw their wages rise at some of the fastest rates ever recorded. All told, in the 3 years leading up to the pandemic, poverty reached an all-time low. Real median income increased by almost $6,000 per household, and the bottom 50% of American households saw their wealth increase by over 70%. The recipe for this broad-based prosperity was lower taxes and less regulation. Today, after 2 years of mandates, subsidies, and expert control, government has all but eviscerated this strong foundation. Americans have been forced to endure governments shuttering their livelihoods, schools, and communities. Measured against the pre-pandemic trend, 6.6 million workers are currently missing from the workforce. These Americans are missing out on not only the financial rewards of the job, but also the community and purpose that come from work. In contrast with the pre-pandemic economy that especially benefited low-wage workers and historically disadvantaged Americans, these groups are again falling further behind. With more government getting in the way, middle class and low wage workers are hurting the most. Democrats' $1.9 trillion partisan spending has ignited the worst inflation in 4 decades. Inflation that's hitting my home state of Utah harder than almost anywhere else. Even if prices were to stop rising tomorrow and things just held in place as they are now, Utah families will have to pay nearly $8,500 this year just to afford the same items that they purchased at the beginning of the Biden administration. This according to the Joint Economic Committee's state inflation tracker. Meanwhile, school closures have caused devastating learning losses for the youngest and lowest income students. The Penn-Wharton budget model estimates that these losses will weaken our productivity and wages for the next 30 years. Unconditional stimulus checks and explicit anti-work incentives have increased the use of harmful substances at a time of vulnerability for many Americans. Drug overdose deaths are back to an all-time high, and suicides and alcohol abuse have also spiked. Lockdowns have triggered rising crime rates across the country, causing Americans to feel less safe in their communities. The murder rate jumped almost 30% in 2020, the largest increase ever on record. It's clear that so-called investments from Washington have failed to produce the prosperity the Biden administration promised. And many of the proposals I hear from my colleagues will make problems worse, much worse. Plans to keep spending money that we don't have will pour more fuel on the inflation fire. Tax hikes on businesses will make it harder for Americans to innovate at home and harder to compete abroad. And legislation that takes a clue from China's state-directed economy by federally commandeering research and development here in the United States is the opposite of what has made America the world's strongest and most prosperous nation. We'll never beat China by becoming more like China. Never. We know what works. Before the pandemic, tax cuts and deregulation supported a thriving economy, one that benefited families and workers of all walks of life. The free market system that prizes ingenuity and rewards people for using their God-given talents in service of their neighbors resulted in benefits for the Americans who needed it most. After 2 years of policies that have assaulted and eroded this strong foundation, I hope we can learn from our mistakes. I hope we've learned that when we choose to remove government barriers to Americans' creativity and freedom, families of all types prosper. Thank you.
Senator, thank you very much. Now I'd like to introduce our four distinguished witnesses. Dr. Josh Bivens is the Director of Research at the Economic Policy Institute. His areas of research include macroeconomics, fiscal and monetary policy, the economics of globalization, social insurance, and public investment. Prior to becoming Director of Research, Dr. Bivens was a research economist at EPI. Before that, an assistant professor of economics at Roosevelt University, and provided consulting services to Oxfam America. Dr. Bivens has a PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research and a BA from the University of Maryland at College Park. Dr. Michelle Holder is the president and CEO of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Dr. Holder is also an associate professor of economics at John Jay College, City University of New York, where she's currently on academic leave. Her research focuses on the Black community and women of color in the U.S. labor market. Before joining CUNY, Dr. Holder worked as an applied economist in the nonprofit and government sectors for a decade, and also served as finance director at Demos. Dr. Holder earned a PhD and an MA in economics from the New School for Social Research, an MPA from the University of Michigan, and a BA in economics from Fordham University. Dr. Sudeep Parikh is the Chief Executive Officer of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and executive publisher of the Science family of journals. From 2001 to 2009, Dr. Parikh served as science advisor and professional staff at the U.S. Senate Appropriations Committee, where he was responsible for negotiating the budgets for the NIH, CDC, BARDA, and other scientific and health agencies. Prior to joining AAAS, Dr. Parikh was Senior Vice President and Managing Director at DIA Global. Before that, he was General Manager of the Health and Consumer Solutions Business Unit and Vice President at Epic. Dr. Parikh earned his PhD in macromolecular structure and chemistry from the Scripps Research Institute in La Jolla, California, and a BA in materials science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Finally, Dr. Tyler Goodspeed is the Klein-Heinz Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. From 20 to 21, he served as acting chairman and vice chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, after being appointed as a member of the CEA by President Trump in 2019. In that role, he advised the Trump administration's economic response to the coronavirus pandemic, as well as subsequent economic recovery packages. He also served briefly as the chief economist, maybe not briefly, for macroeconomic policy and senior economist for tax, public finance, and macroeconomics at the CEA. Before that, Dr. Goodspeed was on the faculty of economics at the University of Oxford and was a lecturer in economics at King's College London. He's also an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. Dr. Goodspeed received his BA, MA, and PhD from Harvard University and received his MPhil from the University of Cambridge. Dr. Bivens, let's begin with your testimony, and then we'll continue in the order of introductions. Dr. Bivens, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank the chair, vice chair, and ranking member and the rest of the committee for the chance to talk today about building on a strong foundation. I'm Josh Bivens, a macroeconomist and the research director of the Economic Policy Institute. EPI is a think tank whose mission is to make sure the economic fortunes of low and middle income families are given their proper due in policy debates. And I'd like to make a couple of quick points in this statement, and these are mostly fleshed out in the written testimony I've submitted. First, I would say US economic growth before the pandemic over a span of decades was too slow and too unequal. Over each successive business cycle since 1979, average growth slowed and the share of income accruing to the bottom 90% of the population declined. From this very broad overview, there doesn't seem to be any trade-off between equity and growth. Instead, less equity has gone hand in hand with slower growth. Second, overall growth clearly has been hampered by a pronounced slowdown in public investment over that time period. This contraction of public investment did not lead to more private investment. Instead, all forms of investment have been weak in recent decades outside of a pretty brief one-off period in the late 1990s as the US business sector connected to the internet. While there are some tools that hold some promise to induce more private investment, they largely do not include tax cuts for capital owners and corporations, nor broad-based assaults on federal regulations. Instead, what can work to induce more private investment is to keep the economy pinned at full employment, make sure recessions are short, recoveries rapid, and taking measures to incentivize technologies of the future, like things that might boost private investments in fields like clean energy. But of course, the most direct way to boost overall investment through public policy is simply by undertaking more public investment in both shared physical infrastructure, as well as human capital and families' economic security more generally. Given the large rise in inequality in recent decades, income growth for the middle fifth of households has lagged far behind even the slower overall growth over this time period. Crucially, the vast majority of growth for the middle fifth of households can be attributed to the legacy of past rounds of large-scale investments in social insurance. To say it more plainly, without the influence of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, income growth for the middle fifth of U.S. households since 1979 would have been essentially stagnant. Since the beginning of 2021, we've made a very good start in trying to build a better post-pandemic economic or economy. The first order of business was undertaking a substantially more ambitious fiscal policy response to the pandemic recession. The result has been a far more rapid jobs recovery since the end of the pandemic recession when compared to some more other previous recessions. However, stabilizing the economy after a shock is just a necessary, not a sufficient condition for reversing the slow and unequal growth of recent decades. A full reorientation of policy to significantly boost incomes and economic security for the vast majority requires continued public investments in both infrastructure and people. I would say blocking these investments in the name of fighting the recent rise in inflation makes very little sense from either an economic perspective or a policy perspective. For one, fighting inflationary surges by throttling back demand growth is just not a job that fiscal policy is nimble enough to do. There are huge lags between the time when fiscal policymakers start debating an issue, passing a bill to address it, and then it gets implemented. Those long lags are why the Federal Reserve is the nation's first line of defense against inflationary surges. That division of labor makes a lot of sense. Second reason why it makes little sense to block proposed investment packages in the name of fighting inflation is that most of these recent proposed public investment packages, they're not fiscal stimulus. It is not meant to be a very large surge of spending in the short run that boosts spending and puts inflationary pressure in the economy. Instead, the spending is spread out over a long period of time. It is gradual. It is meant to provide long-lived investment, not fiscal stimulus. And many of the investment proposals put forward recently have been fully paid for. So that would blunt even the incredibly minimal inflationary pressure that spending would put into the economy. And finally, I would say the evidence linking the inflation of 2021 and early 2022 to sort of economic overheating caused by too generous fiscal relief passed passed in response to the COVID pandemic and the American Rescue Plan specifically is exceedingly weak. Just the clearest reason why is the inflation has been global. You look across countries, they did very, very different things in terms of their fiscal response to COVID. We were on the more generous end. Many countries did much less generous fiscal relief, and yet the inflation experience is about the same everywhere. So linking it to something that's specific just in the US misses the global picture. And finally, I'll just end by saying that going forward, both the fiscal response to the COVID shock and further federal investments will make future inflationary outbreaks like we've seen in the past year far less likely. This past year's inflation has its roots in past policy failures, most conspicuously the failure to invest enough in both fighting recessions with proper force and in building up the nation's full productive capacity. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk on this issue.
Dr. Bivens, thank you very much. We'll now hear from Dr. Holder. Dr. Holder, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Chair Beyer, and thank you as well to Ranking Member Lee, Vice Chair Heinrich, and members of the Joint Economic Committee for inviting me to speak today. It's an honor to be here. My name is Michelle Holder. As Chair Beyer noted, I'm the President and CEO of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, an organization that seeks to advance evidence-backed ideas and policies that promote strong, stable, and broad-based economic growth. I also serve as an associate professor of economics at John Jay College, which is part of the City University of New York system. At Equitable Growth, we aim to understand how economic inequality in all its forms affects growth and stability. The evidence demonstrates the decades-long trend of increasing inequality that hurts both families and the long-term trajectory of the U.S. economy. Making different policy decisions that support key public investments in social and physical infrastructure can help reverse inequality and make our economy stronger. Today, I will show how 3 pillars of robust government investment have previously been and continue to be vital to promoting racial equity and boosting economic growth. The first pillar is ensuring a full and equitable recovery from the COVID-19 recession. The second pillar is revitalizing the manufacturing sector. And the third pillar is strengthening the future by leading on green energy. Let's start with the recovery efforts. By passing the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan, the government made key investments to support workers and stabilize our economy. What were the results? For starters, the bounce back in GDP was much quicker in the US than any developed country. While inflation is elevated across the globe, as my colleague Dr. Bivens pointed out, the US has created more jobs and higher wages than most developed nations. And the overall unemployment rate is now close to its pre-pandemic level. One of the more powerful policies that came from the federal government's response was the expansion of the child tax credit. By providing families with monthly income support to supplement their own earnings, the enhanced credit lifted an estimated 3.7 million children out of poverty. It also helped reduce racial disparities in household income, as poverty rates fell drastically for Black and Latinx children. This type of policy is a clear blueprint for success. Building off this blueprint, government investment can also make a positive difference for a manufacturing sector that could once again be an engine for equitable economic growth. There is strong precedent for this. Research suggests that prior public investments in manufacturing, particularly during World War II, had long-term positive effects on growth, employment, and wages. Historically, the manufacturing sector has been a path to the middle class, especially for Black and Latino workers with less formal education. While upward economic mobility has been limited by racism, including discrimination and segregation, manufacturing continues to play an important role in providing good union jobs. A recent Economic Policy Institute report finds that Black, Latinx, Asian American, and Pacific Islander and white workers without a college degree all earn substantially more in manufacturing than in non-manufacturing industries. For instance, for median wage, non-college educated employees, both Black and Latinx workers in manufacturing earn 18% more annually than in non-manufacturing industries. The problem is, manufacturing employment in the US has been steadily declining for decades, and productivity in manufacturing has been slowing. This decline has resulted in significant earnings and employment losses, particularly for Black workers, many of whom live in former industrial hubs. We therefore have ample room for investments in manufacturing. These can include, but are not limited to, high road purchasing by the federal government, R&D spending, and equitable trade policy. Finally, the third public investment pillar is strengthening the future by leading on green energy. Recent economic research demonstrates the importance of investments in green energy. For example, Columbia University economist Joseph Stiglitz demonstrates that investments in renewable energy and energy efficiency typically have high multipliers, meaning initial investments generate additional economic activity over time and thus delivers high returns. They also create more jobs, including ones that can't be taken offshore, such as those in home energy retrofitting. Moreover, according to recent research from Heidi Garrett-Peltier, an economist at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, for every $1 million in public investments in renewable energy or energy efficiency, almost 3 times as many jobs are created than if the same money were invested in fossil fuels. In conclusion, there is clear precedent and ample opportunity for government investments to promote growth and address the harmful consequences of economic stratification in our nation. To make the U.S. economy more resilient and equitable, we need to build off the strong foundations of the current recovery and continue to make robust investments, especially in manufacturing and green energy. Thank you.
Dr. Holder, thank you very much. I will now hear from Dr. Parikh. Doctor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Beyer, Ranking Member Lee, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me today. I'm a biochemist and not an economist, so I want to talk about the future in a slightly different way. I'd like to ask you a simple, hopefully rhetorical question, which is, do we want to be the nation that discovers, develops, and manufactures the economic, environmental, and health advances of the future? Or do we want to be a nation that lags in these critical areas while we attempt to buy solutions from, at best, friendly competitors, or at worst, geopolitical adversaries? In the 1800s, Europe was the center of gravity for scientific discovery. English scientist Michael Faraday was describing an electricity-related discovery to Parliament. And future Prime Minister William Gladstone asked, "What use is it?" And Faraday supposedly replied, "I don't know, but there's every probability that you'll soon be able to tax it." He was right. The discovery of electricity marked an inflection point in history, opened entirely new fields of technology, and improved the well-being of humanity, leading to everything from the light bulb to the internet. It also grew the economy in ways that we never imagined. Now, today, we stand at the cusp of similar inflection points in many science and engineering fields. Just a few weeks ago, scientists at the Fermi Lab in Illinois reported that the W boson, which is a fundamental particle, weighs more than it's predicted by the standard model of physics. Now, you may ask what that means. If this finding is repeated and verified, it means that there's a completely new frontier of physics for us to discover beyond what's currently known. It could be a discovery that parallels Benjamin Franklin's epiphany. The sparks that he could make on Earth were caused by the same phenomenon as lightning in the sky. A little bit more expensive than a key, but the same kind of thing. And someday it could lead to entirely new parts of the economy that you might even be able to tax. Now, even if this discovery doesn't pan out, we are at similar inflection points in the fields of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, synthetic biology, gene editing, space travel, and more. We're at the cusp of revolutions in multiple sciences at once, with potential implications for our economy that could be as game-changing as electricity. Now, for over 75 years, we've followed a recipe that has grown our economy in ways that you couldn't have thought of at the beginning of the 1900s. Investments in research at the Department of Defense, NIH, NSF, and 20 other federal agencies, coupled with complementary investments by industry, have driven transformative innovation. Investments in R&D have led to sustained bursts of economic activity, bursts of exponential growth in new industries that have led to good jobs across the spectrum. Now, this recipe has been so successful that other nations have copied it, increasingly with even more vigor than us. Now, the time has come for us to redouble our efforts and build on our strengths and show the world again what American intellect, ingenuity, investment, and risk-taking can accomplish for the benefit of all Americans. So today I'd like to make 3 recommendations to ensure that we continue to lead the world in scientific discovery and deliver its benefits to all. The first is to provide robust investment in research and development across a broad range of disciplines and geographies. Second, we should be investing in our people to ensure that we are drawing upon the talents of all Americans in our scientific research and that all Americans benefit from our investments. Third, we need to balance a portfolio of R&D investment that includes short-term incremental research, translational research, and high-risk, high-reward research that, if successful, could change lives and revolutionize the economy. I provide a lot more detail about these recommendations in my written testimony, but it's important to remember that the world is not standing still. Remember the extraordinary result I talked about from scientists at Fermi Lab that might change our fundamental understanding of physics? Well, the instrument where that data was collected was decommissioned several years ago. So the verification of that result is not going to come in the US. It'll have to come from the cutting edge instruments of today, which are based in Europe and Asia and not in the US. In the last 20 years, US R&D expenditure from all sources, government and industry, has only grown at a rate of 3.1% annually in constant prices. This investment has been eclipsed by the meteoric 14.3% annual rise of China's R&D expenditure over the same period, as well as more robust investments by many others. Look, no nation on earth is more responsible than the United States for getting us to the cusp of inflection points in so many scientific disciplines. Inflection points that could create step changes in economic growth and human well-being. The decisions that we make today on where and how to invest are going to determine whether we will make the discoveries and translate the science into health and prosperity, or whether someone else will, or whether, worst of all, no one else will. So will the advance that changes the world come in Chicago, in Shanghai, or nowhere? Recognizing our potential, I remain optimistic that we're going to rise to the challenges, and I stand ready to work with you and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Dr. Marik, thank you very much. Fascinating stuff. And now let me finally recognize Dr. Goodspeed for his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Beyer, Ranking Member Lee, Vice Chairman Heinrich, and members of the committee. As noted, I served on the Council of Economic Advisors from 2017 to 2021, including as acting chairman of that council from 2020 to 2021. I'm now Klein-Heinz Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. I wanted to take this afternoon to reflect on the economic recoveries from the two most recent US recessions and the lessons from those recoveries for prospective economic policy. So the labor market recovery from the 2007 to 2009 global financial crisis was the slowest in post-war US history, taking 77 months to recover the jobs lost during the recession compared to a post-war average of 23. And when the Council of Economic Advisors studied this unprecedentedly slow recovery, we observed two historical anomalies. First, the contribution of capital intensity to labor productivity growth actually turned negative. That means that firms' investment in new plant and equipment per worker was insufficient to keep pace with depreciation of existing capital, plant and equipment per worker. Second, despite ongoing population growth, the prime age labor force in the United States, those between the ages of 25 and 54, either employed or actively looking for work, shrank by 1.6 million workers from the start of the recovery in July 2009 through the end of 2016. So it was in response to this anomalously slow recovery that in 2017 to 2019, the US government implemented an agenda of tax and regulatory reform designed to lower the cost of domestic business investment, including in domestic energy production, and to reduce tax expenditures and reinvest those revenue savings into marginal personal income tax rate reductions in order to encourage increased labor force participation. And the results are quite striking. So whereas between July 2009 and December 2016, the prime age labor force shrank by 1.6 million workers, from January 2017 through December 2019, the prime age labor force actually increased by 2.3 million workers. Real inflation adjusted wages for the bottom 10th of the wage distribution rose 10% during that period compared to 5% for the top 10th of the distribution. The exact opposite pattern of what prevailed from July 2009 through the end of 2016. And real median household income in the 3 years from 2017 through 2019 rose by more, $5,900, than in the entire 20 years from 1996 to 2016. So as a result, wage, income, wealth inequality declined, labor share of income rose. Now, that's where we were on the eve of the COVID shock, which the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development projected would result in a 12% decline in US output over the 4 quarters of 2020. And this Congressional Budget Office projected that the unemployment rate would end the year above 10%. Instead, the unemployment ended the year at 6.7%, and even the broadest measure of labor market underutilization had declined to 11.7%, which was lower than in August 2014. So by December 2020, the US had recovered 55% of the job losses of March and April 2020, and the US economy had recovered 78% of the decline in the level of output. So it was in the face of this 11-month-old recovery that Congress in March 2021 passed a fiscal stimulus equal to 9% of the US economy, with the immediate effect that demand for goods increased 10.7% month over month in March 2021. That is a huge increase in demand at the same time that the supply side was still recovering. And furthermore, some of the provisions in that package actually further impaired the supply side recovery by raising implicit marginal tax rates on the return to work and introducing some business tax uncertainty. As a result, whereas in the 12 months through February 2021, inflation had risen by less in the United States than in the euro area, since February 2021, the increase in the rate of inflation in the United States was 5 times greater than in the euro area, using a harmonized index of consumer price inflation to compare apples to apples. Therefore, explanations of high US inflation that are global in nature, semiconductor shortages, supply chain disruptions, cannot explain all or most of the increase in inflation in the United States, because inflation has risen by so much more here than in other advanced economies. And as a result, sector-specific investments and subsidies are unlikely to resolve inflationary pressure that is fundamentally macroeconomic in nature. Rather, I think the lesson of recent recoveries from recession in the United States is that we should ensure broad-based incentives to domestic capital formation and labor force participation. The lesson from 2017 to 2019 is that this is the policy recipe for generating strong and long-run sustainable economic growth that delivers real gains across the income distribution.
Dr. Goodspeed, thank you very much. We've heard from our witnesses and now turn to questions. So let me start, Dr. Bivens. In your recent testimony, you say many continue to insist that the American Rescue Plan is the root cause of recent inflation. In fact, we just heard this from Dr. Goodspeed. And hence any further fiscal policy interventions should be blocked in the name of reining in this inflation. And these arguments rest on extraordinarily flimsy evidentiary grounds. Dr. Goodread has postulated that the inflation is fundamentally macroeconomic in nature, which my interpretation means too much money. The unemployment insurance, child tax credits, and the like. Dr. Bivens, why is this argument false? Why is it not true?
Yeah, as I sort of mentioned in my statement, and which is in my testimony, the rest of the sort of for countries we have data on what the fiscal response to COVID was. It's kept by the IMF. They have a fiscal policy database where they measure countries' response. There is no relationship between the size of the fiscal response and the acceleration in inflation those countries have seen in the past year relative to the pre-pandemic. And so any idea that we can sort of pin the uptick in inflation we've seen in the US on specific pieces of legislation, particularly, I just don't think it's there, because we can do that using the IMF data on fiscal policy response and inflation. And then I think there's plenty of other reasons to think it's not just a simple imbalance of supply and demand. I think there's lots of the distortions that the pandemic imposed on the US economy and the global economy that can account for a lot of the common inflation experience. And then finally, I would just say there's an argument about the past. It's good. We should have it. We should understand what happened. Then there's an argument about what's going forward and the sort of investment packages that have been proposed in Congress in recent months. Those are very different from the fiscal stimulus that was passed earlier in the year. Whatever you think about the American Rescue Plan, it was meant to be stimulus. It was meant to be entirely front loaded and to provide a real sort of burst of spending in a very short period of time. The proposed investment packages, largely in front of Congress, they don't do that. They're much more gradual, much less of the spending hits in the first year. They are meant to be a near permanent increase just in the level of public investment that is done. So even their spending will have much less inflationary effect. And then many of the proposals come with pay-fors that will raise revenue, and that will further blunt even the very minimal inflationary impact that might come from the spending. So I think the analysis of why do we have inflation so far, linking it to the American Rescue Plan, is pretty flawed. And then I think even if you believed that, that has very little relevance to the debates about whether or not we should do long-lived investment plans, which are different than the stimulus that people are talking about in terms of past fiscal measures.
Thank you very much. Dr. Holder, you wrote and spoke that employment gains made by Black, women, and Latino workers suggest that the recovery efforts in the past usually come to them last. And yet in this recession, they've been going, it hit a much quicker pace than previous recessions. What part of our rescue plan so far has helped it reach the people who need it most more quickly?
Yes, thank you for the question, Chair Beyer. I'll talk about the American Rescue Plan. Now that piece of legislation helped add an average of over 500,000 jobs per month through the end of 2021, for a total of 6.1 million new jobs in 2021. As my colleague, Dr. Bivens just noted, the American Rescue Plan was fiscal stimulus meant to encourage and to support increased demand for goods. And by doing that, the natural result would be job creation. And so ARP precisely reached that goal of increasing demand, stimulating demand, and thereafter leading to job creation. And by comparison, that level of job creation, 500,000 jobs per month, eclipses monthly job growth after the Great Recession, our last big cyclical downturn, which job creation averaged just about 130 jobs a month from 2010 to 2011. Economic evidence suggests this success also extends to wages. Wages are increasing for those who've historically been left behind during past recoveries. Using the Atlanta Fed's wage growth tracker, we see younger workers saw a 9.7% wage increase, and the bottom 25% of earners saw a 5.1% raise. Workers with a high school education and those at the bottom of the income distribution all saw wage growth stronger than average for recovery periods. This is still true when you account for the effects of inflation. Multiple sources find that around the bottom 70% of workers had real hourly wage increases over the past 2 years. While there's still much work to be done, such as the care sector, which is currently lagging behind, it is clear that the recovery efforts have been a boon to working families. And I will end by saying actions such as the economic impact payments, supplemental unemployment insurance payments, $350 billion in funding for state and local governments to save jobs and sustain aggregate demand in the face of budget shortfalls, and other measures were vital to supporting families as the economy recovers.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Holder, very much. And my time is up, but I'm hoping we have a second round because Dr. Parikh, I want to get back to your heavy W boson before we go. So, I love you to recognize the good senator from Utah, Senator Lee.
Thank you. Dr. Goodspeed, President Biden and many of my colleagues here claim that inflation is primarily the result of two things. First, Russia's war on Ukraine, and secondly, corporate greed. But you've noted in your testimony that inflation was caused by the federal government flooding the economy and doing so with more than $5 trillion of spending at the same time that politicians were trying to keep our businesses closed and actively disincentivizing work. Now, Dr. Bivens argues that the evidence linking inflation to fiscal stimulus is quote unquote exceedingly weak. Can you break this down for us? And to what extent is inflation the result of some combination of corporate greed and Putin's aggression on the one hand, and on the other hand, to what extent has inflation been triggered by excessive fiscal stimulus?
Thank you, Senator. So I think that the important thing to do is to have an appropriate control group. And that's why in my testimony, I pointed to the Euro area, which is another large advanced economy, globally integrated. And yes, there was fiscal stimulus across advanced economies in 2020. The key divergence occurred in 2021 and specifically March 2021. And that's why I think it is an observation that must not be ignored, that in the 12 months through February 2021, inflation in the United States averaged 1%. Inflation in the Euro area averaged 1.1%. Since February 2021, the increase in the rate of inflation in the United States has been more than 5 times that in the Euro area, and that preceded the invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. It seems like a very good control group, and I think that backs up your answer. Dr. Goodspeed, as you pointed out, the economy delivered widely shared prosperity for Americans, that is prior to the pandemic. In 2019, the real median household income grew by a record 6.8%. And this took us to an all-time high of nearly $69,000. Poverty, meanwhile, fell to a record low for Americans across every race, every ethnicity. Now, some analysts have claimed that our prior economic achievements were simply a natural continuation of the roughly decade-long recovery from the Great Recession, and that workers would have been even better off had the government spent and regulated more during the years between 2008 and 2020. Do you think that alternative narrative is correct? And what do you think we can learn from the pre-pandemic economy that might be applicable today?
Right. So first of all, I would say that one can estimate a trend in various macroeconomic indicators during the expansion period from July 2009 through the end of 2016. You can project those trends into 2017, 2018, 2019, and there was a huge outperformance relative to trend. But you don't have to take my word for it on that. Just look at what the Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, was projecting in their final projection in 2016. And relative to those projections, the US economy through the end of 2019 added 5 million more jobs than projected. And in the first 2 months of 2020 alone, the US economy added more jobs, almost 500,000, than the Congressional Budget Office had previously projected for the entire year. GDP, the gross output of the United States economy, was $300 billion, or 1.2% larger, and the unemployment rate 1.4 percentage point lower. So I think that this was an outperformance relative to trend and relative to forecasts. And I think the lesson to be learned is that when you have in place broad-based incentives to, as I pointed out earlier, increase domestic business investment and increase labor force participation, then you observe gains across the board. And in fact, we saw, as I said, not just the bottom tenth of the distribution do better than the top 10th. We saw wealth inequality decline. We saw workers' wages rise faster than managers' wages. And that was a complete reversal from the trends that were underway pre-2017.
Oh, thank you. That's helpful. As I mentioned in my opening comments, I am a little bit worried about the fact that both the House and the Senate have passed different bills moving us in a direction of industrial policy to the tune of $250 billion to $400 billion in federal spending. Do you think starting down that path, the path of state-sponsored industrial policy, is the best way to, help us achieve long-term economic growth? And what do you think the consequences of that would be?
Well, it hasn't worked in the past, and I might suggest that you just ask the United Kingdom or France circa 1970s.
Great. Thank you. I see my time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Goodspeed.
Thank you, Senator, very much. Let me recognize the distinguished congressman from Madison, Wisconsin, Mr. Pope.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of our panelists today. Appreciate it. It seems odd that, we've had record fast recovery. We've got job creation and low unemployment. Because of quality science, we're largely leaving the COVID era. The COVID hangover is done. Yet inflation right now for people seems to block all of those really good things that have happened. That rescue plan, as Dr. Bivens talked about, putting money immediately in the economy, the infrastructure bill that in a more long-term way puts money into the economy. But what I just heard was that inflation, according to Democrats, is because the war in Ukraine, which certainly is having an additional impact on gas prices and on corporate greed, which I'm going to ask about in a second. But I've been a small business owner since I was 23 years old, since I had a pretty full head of hair. It's a long time ago. And I can tell you, what I found is when everything reopened last year here in the country and around the world, because we don't make enough things in the United States and because everywhere stopped production, there was a lot of demand for everything at once. Scarcity drives up the cost of goods, and we're all paying more. I had three steel increases last year. I had one this year, and I just got a new one that went up 11% again on purchasing of steel. So I guess the questions I have, Dr. Bivens, let me start with you. This question of corporate profits, I went to your website and I saw you've got some stuff there. Can you just talk a little bit about corporate profits and inflation? And can you talk about the fact that we don't make things here anymore and we've lost that control and how that affects inflation in particular?
On the corporate profit issue, just as a matter of decomposing what has driven in an accounting framework sort of the rise of prices in sort of the non-financial corporate sector. We have data that lets us do that. Like during normal times, labor costs are supposed to contribute about 60% to costs, profits about 15%. If you look since sort of the trough of the pandemic recession until now, labor costs are only contributing about 8%. Normally it's 60. Corporate profits are well over 50%. It's supposed to be 15. And so it is clearly the case that it is sort of thicker profit margins that are an accounting way, the much bigger thing driving price increases. What does that mean? To my mind, it means a couple things. It means one, just there were some extreme distortions imposed on the economy by the pandemic and basically a huge swing away from services into durable goods. Take the example of used cars. A lot of people move to the suburbs, no longer take public transit to work. They have to get a car, huge demand in this narrow sector of used cars. Just as supply chain snarls, also driven by the pandemic, made it really hard to deliver those used cars. If you were a dealer who had cars on your lot, you made out like gangbusters. And so your profit margins went up. And so I think it's mostly those pandemic distortions that have channeled corporate power into price increases this time. And then I think, I just talked about the supply chain snarls being a forcing factor there. Yeah, I think a lot of those snarls are because over the past couple of decades, we've chosen a mode of production that just makes sure the component is always produced in the absolute cheapest place possible without trying to build any resiliency into the system. And so I think that has led to the companies to spread out things in ways that made supply chains very fragile because they were way too myopic. And I think that's a big problem. And I think we also just didn't do the public investment in the basic infrastructure like ports that would have provided some more resiliency too. So I think all those things add up to the perfect storm of inflation that we have.
And if I can, in the minute and 10 seconds or so I have left, specifically gas and food, those are the two biggest things I'm hearing wherever I go. I remember when gas prices went up last March, when Texas didn't invest in their grid and they had cold weather, and suddenly, power went out and the prices stayed up. And yes, they've gone up again because of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, but they maintained that level for a long time, and also on food prices. Can you talk just a little bit about gas and food in 46 seconds?
I'll try. I mean, I'll say so. It's the gas and food prices that they tend to always be volatile. There's very little you can do in the very short run with macro policy to tamp them down, and you probably shouldn't try. You'll just cause more collateral damage if you do. People forget they also do go down, that they really do eventually. And so that's the only sort of word of comfort. And I do think there is some suggestive evidence that they don't go down quickly enough after a spike, and that could actually be some manifestation of corporate power and even some price gouging. And so to the degree that regulatory agencies should keep an eye on that and to make sure that prices go down as input costs go down, I think that's something to think about for sure.
Appreciate it. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pocan, very much. Let me now recognize my friend from Arizona, Dr. Congressman Schwed.
Thank you, Chairman Beyer. Interesting witnesses, some bizarre statements, and particularly in some of the write-ups, but I guess it's not polite to take shots at each other's witnesses. Particularly one of the witnesses, and forgive me if I mispronounce the name, Dr. Parikh, really appreciate the discussion and fixation on disruption and technology leaps and what that means to future prosperity. I almost wish I can convince Don to have a discussion of what a disruptive competitive economy embracing technology would mean for productivity, for the wealth of the working poor, those things. Mr. Chairman, I have a number of charts and reports I wish to put into the record that basically show, and it's graph after graph after graph, that the Democrats on your spending binge from last March, and you can actually see on chart, here's one on rents, on fuel, on food, that basically you see the charts just blow up after March last year. So with your permission, I would like to submit those for the record.
Without objection.
Dr. Goodspeed, sometimes the simplest chart actually explains the story. I'm holding one here that basically is inflation and real wages. So real purchasing power for the working poor, the middle class. And it shows, as you see that alligator mouth expanding, it shows you that the fact of the matter is the brothers and sisters in this country are getting poorer every single day. And the math is the math. I mean, I know our friends desperately want to run away from this, but the math is the math. They're getting poorer every day, and it's because of fiscal policy, and probably 50-50. It's half. The Federal Reserve built a pile of kindling, and a year ago we threw a flaming log on it. If I turned to you, Doctor, and said, from a policy standpoint, what could we do right now to spike productivity so we would make more things, so there'd be more goods and services to purchase, maybe tapping down inflation? Are there things we could do to encourage people to move money into their retirement funds to remove liquidity. What could we as Congress do right now to do some mitigation of this inflation monster that's really hurting retired people and working people in the country?
Well, thank you, Congressman. And yes, I think you're quite right to point out that real wages have been struggling to keep pace with inflation, and that's not surprising. Historically, that is what happens because wage contracts tend to be negotiated at lower intervals than other prices, and so real wages for average American workers have been declining. I think that there are a number of things that Congress could be doing now. One would be to help make up for the large cumulative shortfall in business investment in the United States that has accumulated since the start of the pandemic, introduce some business tax certainty so that firms have an incentive to invest in more plant and equipment in the United States. Because right now there has been a lot of uncertainty, both in the direction of the statutory corporate income tax rate, but also on the question of whether or not the full expensing of new equipment investment will be extended. And
Doctor, if I came to you right there on that subject and said, okay, expensing right now, I think this year we fell to what, 80% of the purchase.
Mhm.
And then if you do inflation, the new cost of the new productive piece of equipment, it's actually, if it's gone up 20%, you're looking at a 40% margin. You have to have a very substantial step up in productivity for that capital investment to actually have value. From a policy standpoint, what if we did we'll put expensing back to 100%, but you don't get it until the productive piece of equipment is in production, is actually producing? What would you do?
Well, I mean, I think without getting into the technicals, I think that some certainty over the longer run direction of expensing is one way to now increase business investment, not only in equipment, but also I would consider expanding it to other asset types. And in addition, I would be looking to provide some regulatory certainty for domestic energy production, and I would provide some certainty on the future direction of marginal personal income tax rates to help encourage workers to return to the labor force because we are still well below pre-COVID levels of labor force participation.
All right, I appreciate that, Doctor. I think on the energy hydrocarbon production, unless we get something cleaned up on the capital stack and the regulatory threat there, I'm fearful we're going to continue to fall further behind in energy. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Schweikert. Now let me recognize my friend from Maryland, Congressman Trump. David, I think you're muted still.
Okay, we off done, Mr. Chairman? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're good.
Thank you, Chairman Beyer, very much. And Dr. Bivens, in your testimony, you talked about ambitious fiscal policy response to the pandemic recession helped pave the way for a stronger recovery. I know we've seen big investments in the American Rescue Plan, big impacts nationally, locally. We were proud to have a $60 million funding in the American Rescue Plan for the Mental Health Association and Addiction here in Maryland, which helped Marylanders. What investments can we make to help provide resources for individuals who are working toward recovery and those entering the workforce after they sought treatment?
That's a really good question. I would say I'm not an expert in that sort of like human services investment. I do think the great thing about the American Rescue Plan, or one of the great things about it, was it gave a lot of flexibility to state and local governments along with substantial resources in order to let them expand those investments. But in terms of the specifics ones we should make and the research on that, that is not my sort of wheelhouse of expertise.
Okay. Any ideas or thoughts about how to highlight these on the state and local level?
No great ones. I mean, I would definitely say one thing I appreciated as well about the fiscal relief that was included in the ARP for the state and local governments was the Treasury Department provided a set of guidelines about what that aid could be and should be used for. And it sort of prioritized things that really would be investments in historically disadvantaged communities, investments in economically distressed communities were really high on the list of things they urge state and local governments to invest in. It sounds to me as a non-expert like those sorts of investments absolutely fit the bill. It discouraged things like it actually forbade just tax cuts across the board. And so it really urged state and local governments to make those investments targeted. How well each state is doing is probably subject to a ton of variance.
Okay, let's jump over to Dr. Parikh. In your testimony, you highlighted the importance of diversity in scientific research. In Maryland, high school graduation rates are on the rise, especially among underrepresented communities. However, unlike their peers, the underrepresented students face additional barriers to higher education that's typically required for a STEM career. So what do we need to do to level the playing field for students of all backgrounds? And what role can career training centers play in bridging that gap?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. Look, we have to start very early. We have to be able to, if we're going to level a playing field, we have to make up for a whole bunch of challenges that have built up over time, and that means starting very early with education around science and math and engineering with kids that are even pre-kindergarten and who can be excited about math. There's a program in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago, that gets young boys and girls on the south side of Chicago interested in algebra in the 5th grade. And it has over 600 alumni that are populating companies like Boeing and elsewhere, terrific engineers. It shows that at the small scale, we can do this. We just have to scale up those kinds of programs to get these kids there.
And our competitors like China and India, are they starting this early?
They are starting extremely early. I will tell you, I can tell you from my own personal family experience that if you are a young child in India, being an engineer or being a doctor is part of the culture. It is part of what we're teaching, of what's being taught to kids that they're going to become. And we've got to be doing that here. We have to set people's expectations to be that high.
U.S. Global research, we used to see 39% of it, Doctor. Now we're down to 30%, and we're heading the wrong way. What are your thoughts about career training in this area to try and get world-class talent?
We have got to make sure that we are pulling talent from the Central Valley of California, from the Appalachia area, from the Mississippi Delta, and from Palo Alto and from Cambridge. We've got to be pulling all of our talent because, look, there's 1.4 billion people in China. There's 330 million people here. We're not going to win this on just sheer numbers. We have this amazing diversity of thought and diversity of experience that comes from the fact that we are a remarkably diverse nation, and we have high-achieving scientific minds in every one of those places. We've got to pull from every one of those areas and also from around.
How about if anybody came here to our country to study, we had to give them a path to citizenship?
We've been on record saying that it would be very important for having scientists who come here to train that if they stay here and they want to be Americans, that we should provide a path.
Agreed. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Drone, very much. Votes will be in about 15 minutes, so we have some more time, and I'd love to start a second round for anybody that's with us. So let me begin. First, Dr. Parikh, thank you for bringing up the heavy W boson. I've not heard of that yet, and I'm anxious to hear how we tax it. But in the meantime, I know in your AAAS role, you know how exciting is what's happening on the fusion side. You know, that if we think about a limitless source of energy, what it can do to economic growth, to poverty, and of course to climate change in the immediate future. And by the way, this is in the Competes Act. You know, more than $1 trillion. Just for fusion. So how does the long time horizon, the non-stimulus nature of the Competes Act, or you see some of the things we're looking at now, the infrastructure bill, how does that play out over the economy? Is this good or is this better or worse as an investment?
You know, it's an incredible investment because what happens, and we've seen patterns of this throughout history, is that in certain areas, we get to an inflection point. Fusion is one of those areas. Fusion has always been, the joke has always been, it's 40 years away, and that we aren't quite there. but there's a remarkable amount of energy right now, but in the private sector and the public sector, moving towards sustainable energy production by fusion. There are public companies that are getting investment and that hope to have inputs and outputs equal by the end of the decade. Now that would be a remarkable achievement. That's harnessing the power of the sun here on Earth and getting just as much energy out as you put in. Now the government's doing that. There are governments around the world working on it. And what it shows is the power of the American ecosystem. We have financial capital. We do have world-beating companies that are working on fusion. We have the U.S. investment in ITER, which is in Japan. We've got an incredible amount of talent that comes together in this ecosystem of public and private sector that I think if anybody's going to do it, I'd put our money on us.
Thank you very much. Dr. Bivens, one of the things I was struck by this afternoon is the different fact sets, figure sets, data sets we have on the past. I respect Dr. Goodspeed's many different charts and analyses, but I'm having trouble reconciling some of them with at least the facts that I've been studying for years. Well, how can it be that the bottom 10% grew more quickly their incomes in the Trump administration, the top 10%, when almost all of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act went to the top 10%, and when the wealthiest two individuals in America have more assets than the bottom 50% combined? How do you put those together?
I think there's something important there. There's two separable questions, which is what is the state of the macroeconomy and the business cycle and labor market tightness versus what is policy doing to either contribute to that or to do things outside of that. And so I totally agree that 2017, 18, and 19 were actually quite good years from a business cycle perspective. I disagree. I think it really was just a continuation of trend. I think what really was the sort of game changer in 2017, 18, 19 relative to what the CBO predicted beforehand was the Federal Reserve for the first time in a long time said, you know what, we're going to let unemployment fall really, really low without preemptively stopping the recovery. And so I think those were very good years, low unemployment, lots of gains, including for low-end workers. And so it reinforces to me the value of low unemployment is really a good thing and something policymakers should always target. Then the question becomes, did the Trump administration policies do anything to lock that in, make it happen faster, secure it for a longer time? And to my mind, the answer to that is absolutely not, for the reason you said. Their signature policy achievement was a tax cut for owners of capital. So the direct benefits went to the richest households. It did almost nothing to boost economy-wide investment, which was its sort of stated rationale. So I think it's true. Tight labor markets are really good for workers, particularly historically disadvantaged workers. And we had tight labor markets in 2017, 18, and 19. I just don't think the Trump policies were the reason why labor markets were tight. I think it really was just a continuation of trend, along with a change, an admirable change in Federal Reserve policy that allowed that to happen.
And despite all that, even with the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, we never did get the 3% growth. In fact, I believe that growth in 2019 before the pandemic was 2.3%, which was, like what it was in 2014. I mean, I'm not bragging on how fast things grew in the aughts. They were too slow. I'm trying to avoid that in the years to come. But let me, I should move on because the clock's turned green. But Mr. Schweikert, are you still with us? Actually, he abandoned us. So I can keep going. Please answer. You seemed eager to. Dr. Bivens?
Yeah, sorry about that. I put myself on mute. I agree with that. I would say the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it really was a pure redistribution policy. It just redistributed a bunch of money to people who own corporate equities largely, and it had almost no footprint at all in increasing the rate of growth in the economy. And I think the biggest, indicator of that is the way it was going to increase the growth rate of the economy, like the way most of its proponents talked about, was increasing business investment. That was really the centerpiece of the economic case for it. business investment did not increase in the wake of the TCJA. It was clearly decelerating rapidly before the pandemic hit. It just had no impact at all on the aggregate economy. All it did was redistribute income around, and it redistributed to the top, which is not the way I would prefer that happen.
Dr. Holder, in your leadership, the Center for Equitable Growth, one of the things that the Joint Economic Committee these 2 years has really focused on is income inequality and wealth inequality. And what are you seeing happening to the Gini index, especially looking at it over the last 10 years and over the last 50 years? Because I keep reading things like Bob Putnam's book that it hasn't been this bad since the 2013, 2015.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Chair Byer. The evidence is very clear that income inequality in the U.S. is increasing. With regard to the Gini coefficient and the direction that is moving, it is absolutely clear that income inequality is widening in the U.S. And I will, if you permit me, we don't only need to look at where the Gini coefficient is going. We could also look at the distribution of income over time. And this is actually a really simple exercise that I give my students in terms of really proving that more income is going to the top 20% of households in this country and less income to the bottom 20%. And so if I could just quickly, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is the statistical arm of the U.S. Department of Labor, is a contains a bevy of information. And so in addition to that, also the U.S. Census Bureau has data. And I believe one of the pieces of data they have, and they, update regularly, is on income distribution in the United States. And one of the tables clearly shows over time that the top 20% of households in the US is taking in an increasing share of all income generated in this country, while the bottom 20% of households, and when I say top 20% of households and bottom 20%, I'm really talking about by income. So low income households, right, versus high earning households or wealthy households. Analogously, the bottom 20% of households, it's very clear over the last several decades, is taking in a smaller share of all income that is generated in this country. And so, along with looking at the direction of the Gini index, the statistical evidence is absolutely clear and undisputable that income distribution is widening and income inequality is widening in the United States. The evidence is very clear and it's concrete.
Thank you. And Dr. Parikh, the good Dr. Goodspeed talked about, maybe in response to a question from my friend Mr. Schweiker, that if we wanted industrial policy, we needed to look at Great Britain or France in the 1970s. What's the difference in terms of our investment in the Competes Act, whatever it ends up being called, the infrastructure bill, in building chip factories, the doubling of the investment in the National Science Foundation? How is that different?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And look, imagine if, as we were coming out of the pandemic, one of the things that's not talked about, we always talk about the discoveries of and how we got the mRNA vaccine and other technologies to get vaccines into the field so quickly. The thing we don't often talk about is the scale up in the manufacturing. The fact that we could go from 0 to 300 million doses in a matter of months is actually an equivalent success to the scientific success. That is remarkable. And it's not something that every country can do. And imagine that if instead of needing the capacity in building and making vaccines, we needed that the solution involved semiconductor microchips. We would not have been able to do that. We would have been beholden to other nations to actually get a solution to the pandemic if that were the case. And there are other areas of our economy that are just that dependent on semiconductor microchips. And we cannot let it be that one of the most critical components of so much of our technology is not actually manufactured here in the United States. And so it is critically important to have not just the infrastructure to do it, but the workforce to do it. And so the rest of that legislation, USICA, Competes Act, is about the funding of the National Science Foundation. I mentioned several critical areas where we're close to an inflection point: artificial intelligence, quantum computing, launch systems to low Earth orbit. These are places where other nations have seen that we are on that cusp and are investing. Now, should we invest the same way? Absolutely not. We should do it the American way, which means that we have this wonderful ecosystem that has federal investment plus industry investment. Industry investment has gotten to around 3% of GDP. That's wonderful. The problem is federal investment has fallen to about 0.6% of GDP. And what that means is we have this imbalance between research and development, and we've got to work on that. So it is different. It is very different from industrial policy that's picking winners. It's not about picking winners. It's about looking at which parts of the scientific ecosystem are about to take that exponential burst of industrial activity and placing some bets.
Thank you very much. I'd really like to thank all of you. The votes actually did start, so I need to go over and do that. But this is a really interesting, productive conversation on a more equitable economy tomorrow. And I appreciate the various charts and interpretations, and these are worth fighting over to understand how best to go forward. Thanks to the efforts of this Congress and the Biden administration, unemployment is down. It's 3.6%. It's just a tenth above, the highlight before the pandemic at the end of the Trump administration. The economy grew at the fastest pace in 40 years. Businesses have hired more workers faster than ever recorded. 30% increase in small business applications over the prior record. But we haven't escaped the global spike in inflation, and that is hurting an awful lot of families, especially families at the low end. So to lower those costs for U.S. workers and families, we've got to advance economic growth and promote competitiveness. We have to act now to build the capacity of the American people and our economy. And I think we started that work with the Infrastructure Investment and the Jobs Act, getting that into law. And the investments in the competition bills are the next step to powering this new era of American leadership in innovation and technology. The investments we've discussed today would drive inclusive economic growth and put us at the front of addressing complex challenges. And they are complex. And we can do it while strengthening the bargaining power of workers and realigning corporate incentives to reward long-term pro-growth investments that generate society and economy-wide returns. So the potential of these investments is exciting. When I hear discussions like this, I deeply believe that America's best days lie ahead. There's a better tomorrow for U.S. families, workers, and businesses. So thank you to each of our panelists for their contributions to this timely and ongoing discussion. And thanks to my colleagues too, coming and going, for being part of this discussion and sharing their insights and their wisdom. The record will formally remain open for 3 business days. This hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.
And with that, informally, thank you so much.